tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So, as many of you know, I started my formal Buddhist practice in a Zen monastery. I left San Francisco in 1992 after I graduated art school, and started with no particular plan other than that there happened to be a friend uh, in New York who said, "Sure, come visit me." So I thought, why not? And I left San Francisco with my violin and $35 in my pocket, and I started hitchhiking, sort of heading east. I went down through LA and across through the desert, and um, passed through Santa Fe. Met an attractive young person in Santa Fe, but kept going, kept wandering north up the Rockies, up the spine of the country, and out across the Great Plains. Got some dangerous rides. Got one with some neo-Nazis on speed in western Nebraska. Survived that one decently. Got some. Never really felt deeply in danger, uh, but it wasn't entirely safe. Ended up going across the Midwest up into Canada at Thunder Bay and around the top side of the lakes, um, down through Toronto and eventually to New York. Found my friend in New York, uh, and then kept going back and just turned around and came back, and I hitchhiked back across the plains back, and I thought, there was that nice young person in Santa Fe. Uh, I had no compass other than, people I might flirt with. So that was the only thing I was following around at that time. So I followed flirtations around the country for a while. Ended up in Santa Fe. The person there was friendly enough that I stayed the summer and worked in a taqueria, um, in the sort of bourgeois arts neighborhood of Santa Fe, and ended up hanging out at this bookstore, this New Age bookstore in Santa Fe. And because I didn't have a home, the owner of the bookstore just let me sleep in the bookstore for a while, and then she hooked me up with a friend of hers who was a kind of a kinesiologist, muscle tester, body worker, healer. So I had a room with him for a while, worked in the restaurant, dated the girl, and and every day after work or before work, I would go to the bookstore, and I was reading my way through kind of the poetry and spirituality sections, and I ended up in the Zen section, Zen and Buddhism section, and I started reading books like Philip Kapleau's Three Pillars of Zen and Zen Mind Beginner's Mind by Suzuki Roshi, and Paul Reps and folks like that, and ended up really falling in love with the Chinese nature poets, um, Li Po and others, and seeing that I was reading so heavily in these poets and writers, the kinesiologist I was living with said, I did a little Zen practice when I was young. And I was like, oh, what was that like? And he said, oh, it was very hard. I said, okay, that sounds great. And at the end of the summer, uh, the girl and I were breaking up. The taqueria was no fun to work at, and I was itching to move on to the next chapter. And and I said to this person I was living with, I said, tell me about that Zen you did. And he said, well, there's two Zen centers in the mountains near here. I said, what's the difference between them? He said, not much difference, but at one of them, uh, they only hit you if you ask for it. And at the other one, they hit you whether you ask for it or not. And so, I'm 22. I was like, well, that sounds more authentic. I'll do that one. So my karma was set, and I ended up at the Bodhimanda Zen Center. It was then called Bodhimandala, of Joshu Sasaki Roshi, an old, troublesome, abusive Roshi, who we much later learned had been possibly kicked out of his priesthood in Japan for embezzling money and abusing women. He ended up in LA, founding a tradition there. And eventually they found him a center in New Mexico with some hot springs that became Bodhimanda. So that was my first center. My my perhaps macho but misguided question was the thing that determined that I went to Joshu Sasaki's lineage instead of the other one that I might have gone to, which which, to be honest, I wish my karma had led me there, but it didn't, which was Roshi Joan Halifax's center, Upaya, just outside of Santa Fe. But karma being what it is, you end up where you end up. Causes and conditions led me to uh, to having never really meditated before. I tried a couple times in my room in Santa Fe, but didn't feel like I knew what to do. I hitchhiked, of course, up to the Zen Center. My last ride was with a guy who was like, who noticed my bald head. I had shaved off my long San Francisco hair, headed for the Zen Center, preemptively. And he said, kid, where are you going? You're too skinny to be a Marine. So I said, I'm going to a Zen monastery. He said, oh yeah, that was the other option. So he dropped me off at the gates. And I stowed my violin under a bunk, and I got a black robe, and wake up was at 3:30, and I just moved in. And within 2 weeks, I was the head cook because the cook left to go to nursing school. And there were only 4 of us students there, and the abbess and her twin sons, who were a little more than toddlers. I ended up telling them long stories to get them to go to sleep and walking them to school, to the school bus, and cooking. I was a terrible cook for the Zen Center. But I learned, I tried to learn. And I sat and sat and sat and sat, and eventually went to the main center in LA, which was then called Cimarron, later called Rinzai-ji. And then I spent some seasons at the training monastery, Mount Baldy, up in the San Bernardino Mountains, deep cold. Did a bunch of the intensive week-long retreats called Sesshin over the years, and got really into it. Thought I wanted to be a monk. I'm glad I didn't become a monk in that tradition. Uh, Over the course of the 6 years I was in and out of there, I went back to grad school for a year and then dropped out and went back to Mount Baldy. Over the years I was there, I both learned to sit still, wrestled with koan, these impossible questions. I never felt like I answered one really satisfactorily. I passed a few of them, not very many, but um, I was never really satisfied with that part of the practice for myself. And in the end, the combination of feeling like I wasn't getting anywhere, they wouldn't give any meditation instruction because they didn't do that, and um, uh, the growing depth of coming out of denial around how abusive our teacher was, uh, finally I was naturally looking for another thing. I found a book of Jack Kornfield's that contained both basic meditation instructions, which I had never been given in 6 years of Zen, and what seemed like a kind, actually humane heart. And I moved to Spirit Rock and was done with Zen. I left. And the very last thing I did in 1999, I had already sat a short retreat at Spirit Rock, and it was shockingly pleasurable after 6 years of Zen. Um, the last thing I did was I went back for the Rohatsu Sesshin. So this is the week-long intensive retreat. It's the most intensive retreat of the year, ending up with a 24-hour-long wakeful period of sitting and walking and wrestling with your koan, simulating the Buddha's final night of awakening on December 8th, ending at 2:30 in the morning with a sort of kind of breakfast and tea, standing around the dining room, delirious after a week of waking at 2:30, going to bed at 10:30, sort of sleeping for 4 hours in between days of retreat, sitting about 16 to 18 hours a day of meditation, including sitting cross-legged for meals and, just the whole um, uh, during the most sort of ritually intense moment, at least at the end. And by the middle of that final Rohatsu, I crossed over the line between Zen is super hard, but I think it's good for me, and maybe I'm getting somewhere, into this is unnecessary and I feel broken, but not in a good way. And so the last few days of that retreat were really difficult because that's a hard phase to be in. Um, I sat through them, and at the end, I was talking with my friends, the monks there, and my friends, and I remember saying to one of the monks, I said, that was hard, and they're always hard, but I think that was hard not in a good way. And he said, I can see it in your eyes. And I said, I'm going to go do a different kind of practice. And he said, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So that was one of the best Zen monks I knew there. Koshin Kane now runs a little Zen center up in the Puget Sound. You look him up, folks in Pacific Northwest. He's a good guy. I left and never came back. Joshu Roshi lived on for many years, finally dying at 106. And only after he died, or right around when he was dying, all of the stories of his abuse for many, many years started pouring out, being gathered. Here's one of my favorite Zen stories. It's the second story in the collection of teaching stories called the Mumonkan. It's Hyakujo and the Fox. Here's a bit of how it's printed. Whenever Hyakujo Osho means teacher, whenever Hyakujo Osho preached a sermon, an old stranger was there, always following the Zen monks and listening to the preaching. When the Zen monks withdrew, so did the old man. It happened one day that he did not withdraw. The master at last asked, "Who is this standing in front of me?" The old man replied, "I am not a human being. In the past days of Kasho Buddha," so that's a Buddha who lived long before our Buddha, Shakyamuni, so millions of years in the past, "I was the head of this monastery. One of my students asked me, I know well that all beings are subject to the doctrine of cause and effect, or karma, right? Karma. All beings are subject to karma. I also know that a Zen master is free from every doctrine. Both of them are doctrines of the Buddha. Now I want to ask you if a Zen master is subject to the doctrine of cause and effect or not." And I answered, "Not subject to the doctrine of cause and effect." Since then I have lived 500 lives as a wild fox. Now, Master, will you please put another word in place of mine and deliver me from the bondage of being a wild fox? And the old ghost asked, is a Zen master subject to the doctrine of cause and effect or not? The master said, The doctrine working of cause and effect is as clear as noonday. The old man at these words was completely enlightened. He made a bow and said, I was already free from the bondage of being a wild fox body and have been living at the back of this mountain. I am sorry to trouble you, but would you please perform my funeral according to the regular ceremony of a dead monk? The master instructed the head monk to tell everyone that after the meal a funeral rite for a monk would be performed. The monks said to each other, We are all well. No one is in the infirmary. What's going on? After the meal, their master simply took them to a cave behind the mountain, took out a dead wild fox with his stick, and then performed the ceremony of cremation. When evening came, the master entered the sermon hall and explained to the monks what had happened. Obaku immediately asked, The ancient happened to answer wrongly in one word, and was changed into the body of a wild fox for 500 lives. If time after time he had given no wrong answers, what would he have been? The master said, Come forward, and I will practice what is not wrong. Obaku thereupon came forward and gave his palm to the master's palm. The master clapped his own hands and laughed. He said, I thought Bodhidharma's beard is red, but you said that the man with the red beard is Bodhidharma. So this is a story about respecting karma, respecting action and its impacts. And I've always reflected on this story thinking about my teacher, Joshu Roshi, and all his misconduct. The ghost follows the monks around, waiting to ask one more time the question that had placed him in the body of a fox for so long, unable to move on. He had been deluded about the relationship of a teacher to karma, but also deluded about the relationship of enlightenment to karma. You know, it's core in the Buddha's teachings, in all of the schools, that when one becomes fully awakened, one no longer generates new karma, new ethically charged action such that one would get reborn. And this is why enlightenment or awakening entails or consists in the end of rebirth. The way that the Buddha describes this is really that the awakened person, because awakening both purifies the parts of the heart that get lost in craving and hatred and delusion, you see through those so clearly, and provides a kind of skill in relationship, traditionally called skill in means, upaya, the name of the Zen center I didn't end up at and wish I had. Upaya means skill in means, skillful means. That karma is no longer produced by the enlightened person, such that it would develop into further rebirth, but karma is always respected. Karma is the nature of charged action. It is the nature of charged action to bear fruit. And the reason that Buddhas don't bear fruit in that way is that they respect karma so deeply and can see so clearly the nature of the relationship between actions and their impacts that they no longer perform actions that have the impact that would cause them personally to be reborn. They still do actions that have impacts in the world, right? The Buddha's actions in founding the Sangha and teaching have had enormous world-shaking impacts. How many people set something in motion that has moved this many people in this many ways for this long? Very few humans have done that, only a few. And here we are, on the 9th of December, 2025, in year 2568 of the Buddhist calendar, in the Thai reckoning, after the death of the Buddha. And we're not just talking about ancient history in this way that's like, oh, there was this interesting person in prehistory. You're here because this person set in motion something that is still profoundly helpful, and moves us in this very moment. That's deep karma for the good. Buddhas don't create karma for ill and for their own individual rebirth because they have purified the precepts, right? They keep the ethical commitments, not out of fear, or obligation, but because their hearts are so clear that there's no longer any wish to cause harm, but there's also the clear seeing that makes it possible to not, in a sense, accidentally cause harm. And this is strange and mystical. I don't know exactly what that means, because the Buddha clearly offended some people and clearly did some actions that did have harmful consequences, right? Like the 8 heavy rules that he placed upon the nuns order that some scholars think he didn't, and that's, that they were placed later by unenlightened patriarchs. But I'm okay with the complicated vision of the Buddha as an actual human who made mistakes in the creating of the Sangha. But the understanding is that, and remember this from the conversation about intentional and unintentional action, the difference between the Buddha and the Jains, that that a mistake actually doesn't create rebirth generating karma, that it's really intention that causes rebirth generating karma. And Buddhas, because they've purified their hearts in such a way, no longer create the intention that would lead to harm in that way, that would lead to further karma. So Buddhas are free from karma, but they always respect it, and they always respect the ethical guidelines that shape karma. The old man who was a fox for so long and who used to be the abbot of the temple probably was very wise, perhaps was very close to liberation. We were just talking last month about the fetters, the 10 great restricting forces in the heart that have to be seen through or let go of before full liberation is possible. One of the very last, remember, is mana, the conceit of self, and the mind that even if deeply concentrated or free, or having access to extraordinary states of meditation, the mind that could still set up oneself in opposition to another as better than in any way is not yet free, right? Not free from that quality of mind. And so that's, that being is called a non-returner, meaning one who doesn't return to the human or animal bodies, but who is not yet free. So perhaps this ghost, right, who had let go of his fox's body, but was still not liberated and was in a spirit body, perhaps he was in that kind of state, very close, but not quite there. And he had come to the realization of this truth of karma. But, and I think this is poignant, he needed it to be witnessed. He needed it to be heard. He needed to go back to his brothers, the monks, and to the new abbot, and to, in a way, and this is crossing traditions a little bit, but in a way to ask for forgiveness for giving a wrong teaching. because he was a teacher. It wasn't just that he made a mistake, it's that he taught it wrong. And that could have had a terrible impact on the lives of his students, you know. And so he wants to make it right, not just for himself, I think, but for the lineage. And he wants to speak it to the teacher. And he asks the question as a student. He says, so now, would you say a word that sets it right? And he asks the question that he was asked so many millennia before, you know, uh, is a Zen master not subject to the law of karma? And the teacher says the law of karma is as clear as the sun at noon, as noonday, right? It's crystal clear if you see it. And with that, the spell is broken, you know. And this is a trope in Japanese literature very commonly, in the no plays. In the first act, you meet, you know, a character, a fierce warrior, a samurai, or a beggar, or a, you know, somebody, and in the second act, it's revealed that they're a ghost, you know. And so, in the first act, there's a wild fox roaming the backside of the mountain where the monastery is, and in the second act, the ghost is revealed to be the former abbot from so long ago. It was like a slow heartbreak as I was practicing in this Zen tradition and really trying to get it, you know, really trying to answer Joshu Roshi's koans, to respond to these questions correctly, but also in a way that was authentic. The koans that Joshu Roshi would give, um, uh, he did this really innovative thing. In the Rinzai tradition, there's a strict set of koans that are, it's like kind of the curriculum that you have to pass. And they always start with the first case in the Mumonkan, the questions of Mumon. And this is the koan of Joshu, the namesake of my Roshi, Joshu and the puppy. Um, a monk goes to Joshu, Master Joshu, and says, does a dog have the Buddha nature or not? Joshu says, no. And what Joshu says is that the thing that has become famous is that Joshu says it in the ancient Chinese. Joshu was Chinese. These are the Chinese founders of the Rinzai tradition. So they're called Joshu and Nansen, etc. But Joshu is Chaochu and Nansen. They all actually have Chinese names. So these are ancient Chinese masters. Joshu says no. So and what he says is mu. And there are traditions where this comes to be called Joshu's mu. Joshu's mu. You know, why does Joshu say no? Everyone knows that all beings have Buddha nature, right? Dogs have Buddha nature. Everything has a Buddha nature. Why would Joshu say no? And your first task, this is meant to lead to your first breakthrough as a Zen student, is to wrestle with this no. Why would he say no? It doesn't make any sense. It's, you know, it's the wrong answer. What's with this no? And I did at one point go looking for a more ethical Zen tradition and a more efficacious one, and I ended up doing Sesshin with Edo Shimano Roshi before I knew about his own ethical misconduct, um, in the Catskills in upstate New York, gorgeous monastery. Um, and there he does give Joshu's Mu as the first koan. And so in the middle of Sesshin, you'll hear people, you know, they've gone way out in the woods into the Catskills to try to get away from people. And one day from across the lake, we just heard this one young kid just shouting, moo, moo, into the woods, trying to figure it out, you know. So traditionally, Joshu's Mu is the first koan to figure out. But Joshu Roshi did this beautiful thing. He felt like the classical Chinese Japanese koans were too abstract for Westerners to start with, and he invented all of these kind of beginner koans that were easier. You know, that weren't as inscrutable, as the 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 old ones. And so, the first koan that I ever got from him, kind of the ones he would start with were like, when you see a pine tree, where are you? Or when you see the full moon, where is God? Or where is your true self when you pick up a rock? And with all of these, he's asking, in a certain way, he's asking he's inviting you to find a more direct kind of what we might just call mindfulness, but we could also call a kind of, a more direct, non-cognitive, non-narrative presence with these sensory experiences. Can you just look at the pine tree? There are a lot of pine trees on Mount Baldy. Can you just look at a pine tree and fully be there with it, not be doing anything else, thinking anything else, not even holding yourself as separate from it, right? So this was sort of the flavor of the first questions or koans there. And um, but as I was there, and I really did come to love him. He was beautiful in a way. He was in his 80s when I met him, already quite old. Um, and we kept thinking he would die, and he just never. He eventually did, but he didn't for a very long time. And um, it's at one point during a party, I played my violin for him. I got special dispensation to warm up, and I played the beginning of the Bach D minor partita for him. Um, and for a while I lived there, Leonard Cohen lived there at Mount Baldy, so I got to have some conversations with him, um, hear his low, low voice chanting the chants early in the morning. Um, at one point, a bunch of us kids, we kind of cornered him in the parking lot. We were like, Leonard, like, come on, like, sing Sisters of Mercy for us. And he was like, no, 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 that's so long ago. I don't know the words anymore. And you know, my friend was like, we'll start. You know, oh, the Sisters of Mercy, they are not forgotten or gone. And he was like, oh, you sing it, you sing it. We couldn't get him to sing it. Um, and He was sweet, really sweet. That was the period where it was just before he became a monk. He had asked Roshi if he could become a monk a long time before, kind of in the early 80s, sort of at the end of his like super popular folk period, and before he made all those like synthesizer kind of hit pop hits that got weird. Um, but he asked if he could become a monk, and supposedly Roshi said, "No, no, you just keep making more sad songs, sing more sad songs." So he wouldn't let him do it. Eventually, he did allow him to become a monk, a lay monk, and it was during that period that Leonard's accountant, his longtime accountant, who was managing his money while he was a monk, drained his bank account and fled the country, and and so he was impoverished. He had nothing left. He had been support. He was also the primary donor for the monastery. He had supported the monastery for many, many, many years. So all of his money was stolen while he was in robes, and that's partly why he came out, and he for several years there. And some of you might have seen these concerts. He went on tour again, really old, you know, and sang all his old hits. And he came and played at the Fox Theater in Oakland, and you know, and the shows were amazing. Like he really gave it. Like he really brought his full force. Um, but he also needed to make some money again after after such a loss. And maybe I'll just say, in honor of Rohatsu, this that when I give meditation instructions And I encourage us to find our center of gravity. That's a quote from Joshu Roshi, that is the Buddha is your center of gravity. Um, and uh, but in the end, the misconduct that colored the entire Sangha, not just his actions, but of course it kind of filtered out into a sort of anything goes kind of tone throughout the Sangha. Um, it started to wear at my heart and the hearts of many of us, and a lot of us left. And by the time he was really being confronted by the larger Zen community for his actions, I had been practicing, with the Theravādans for quite a while, and I felt fully like I had changed lineages, and uh, but it stings in the heart, and that so many of the great Zen lineages suffered this, and in a way, so many of the great Mahayana lineages, many Tibetan lineages also, that came to the West. And there's more to say about that, and maybe about how Zen's radical relationship to the teachings on emptiness were a condition for not respecting karma and cause and impact, action and impact, and that the radical non-dual wildness of Zen was part of was a kind of it was a wisdom the Western community wasn't ready to hold. Or it was a wisdom that many of the Asian teachers who came to the West weren't ready to hold with integrity here. And uh, it was very different in the lineages where the precepts were held not as non-dual invitations to radical emptiness, but as very real, very relational guidelines for tending each other with kindness and care. And so I think that this is part of why I love the old fox that brings himself to Master Hyakujo Osho. No matter how venerable any of us become or our teachers are in any lineage, anyone in power who forgets that karma is real and that actions have impacts and that harm is real will never escape the world of greed, hatred, and delusion, of ignorance, and wanders the world as a ghost. And any of us who care deeply enough to want to realize the truth beyond that it behooves us to remember the fox on the backside of the mountain and always respect the Dhamma. And never forget the guidelines that allow us to hold ourselves in wise relationship with each other, so that our love can be a power for good and not for harm, and that our sanghas can be forces for good and not for harm in the world. All right, blessings of Rohatsu, the awakening of the Buddha and of the great lineage of Zen and Chan.